The pharaoh Ramses III died thinking he'd won. He'd beaten back 2 full-scale invasions by the mysterious Sea Peoples and held Egypt together while the rest of the Bronze Age world was falling apart around him. A collapse so complete it wiped out entire civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean in the space of a generation. If you'd asked anyone in his court who the real danger to Ramses III was, they'd have pointed east, out toward the coast, toward the ships. They'd have been wrong. The danger was already standing in the room with him. For a long time, historians weren't even sure how Ramses III actually died. There's a surviving court document called the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, and it describes a detailed plot. One of his secondary wives, a woman named Tyre, wanted her son Pentawa to take the throne instead of the official heir. So she pulled together a team, harem officials, a magician who supposedly made wax figures to sneak weapons past the palace guards, and even some soldiers, to help stage a takeover. The trial records survive in surprising detail. Dozens of people were put to death or forced to end their own lives. What the records don't make clear is whether the murder itself actually worked. That question went unanswered for 3,000 years. Then in 2012, a team of researchers finally put the mummy through a CT scanner, and there it was, hidden under the wrappings for 3,000 years. His throat had been cut so deep the wound reached his spine. Someone had gone for a kill, that decisive on purpose. The plot had worked completely, and it still got them nothing because Pentawa never took the throne. He was executed too, most likely forced to end his own life right alongside his mother's co-conspirators. Everyone who helped kill the king ended up dead as well. Now jump forward about 2,500 years and swap the knife for a locked door. Shah Jahan, the Mughal emperor who built the Taj Mahal, spent the last 8 years of his life locked up in Agra Fort, put there by his own son. It's worth pausing on how strange that is. This was a man who'd used the wealth of one of the richest empires on earth to build a tomb for his dead wife. A project so over the top, it's still one of the most recognised buildings on the planet 400 years later. When he got seriously sick in 1657, his 4 sons didn't wait around to see if he'd get better. They went straight to war with each other over who would take his place. The winner, a son named Aurangzeb, didn't just beat his brothers. He had at least one of them killed and sent the head to their father as proof. Then he locked Shah Jahan away in a fort with one cruel little detail, a balcony that looks straight out at the Taj Mahal. The man who built the most famous monument to love in human history spent the rest of his life staring at it from a cell his own son had built for him. Aurangzeb went on to rule for almost 50 years and pushed the Mughal Empire to the biggest size it ever reached. By some measures, he came out on top, but it's hard to miss that the empire he took over through betrayal started falling apart not long after he died, partly because he'd spent decades showing everyone around him exactly how this family handled a change of power. Ramses lost his throat to his own wife. Shah Jahan lost his freedom to his own son. Suleiman the Magnificent, probably the most powerful ruler on earth in the 1500s, in charge of land stretching from Hungary to the Persian Gulf, lost his son to his own wife. Suleiman had a favourite son, Mustafa, from an earlier relationship. Mustafa was capable and popular, a skilled military leader, and pretty much everyone, Ottoman officials, foreign visitors, the public, assumed he'd be the next sultan. Then there was Hurrem Sultan, Suleiman's legal wife, whose own sons had basically no shot at the throne, as long as Mustafa was alive and doing well. Most historians agree Hurrem spent years quietly working to turn Suleiman against Mustafa, likely with help from her son-in-law, a powerful official who controlled a lot of what actually reached the Sultan's ears. In 1553, Suleiman called Mustafa to his military camp, supposedly to talk about an upcoming campaign. Mustafa reportedly suspected exactly what was waiting for him there, but he went anyway because refusing a direct order from the Sultan would have looked like he was already starting a rebellion. He was strangled inside his own father's tent, on his father's orders, based mostly on suspicions his stepmother had spent years planting. One account from the time even claims Suleiman watched the whole thing from behind a screen. It worked in the narrowest sense. Hurrem's son Selim did end up on the throne eventually. History remembers him as Selim the Sot, a ruler with little interest in actually governing, and generally seen as one of the weaker sultans during the empire's strongest era. Hurrem got exactly the outcome she'd spent years working for. It's just not clear the empire came out ahead because of it. If you want the strangest version of this pattern though, you have to go to Rome. Because Nero didn't just get betrayed by his blood, he was made emperor by it, and then he killed the person who made him emperor. Nero's mother, Agrippina the Younger, is one of the most ruthless political operators in Roman history. She married the Emperor Claudius, her own uncle, convinced him to adopt her teenage son Nero ahead of his own biological son, and, according to several ancient sources, eventually poisoned Claudius with a plate of mushrooms once Nero's position was secure enough to take the throne. She didn't just want her son to be emperor, she wanted to run the empire through him. For the first few years, that's more or less what happened. Nero was young and Agrippina controlled access to him, controlled his advisors, and expected to control his decisions. But as Nero settled into power, he wanted his mother's grip loosened, not tightened. He started sidelining her from official business. She responded, according to Roman historians, by threatening to back a rival claim to the throne instead, reportedly her own stepson, Britannicus, Claudius's actual biological son, who she'd helped push aside years earlier and could now, in theory, push back into the picture as leverage. Britannicus died suddenly not long after, at a dinner, in front of guests, poisoned, most ancient sources agree, on Nero's order. The son used the same method the mother had used to get him the throne in the first place, this time to remove the last person who could threaten his hold on it. That still left Agrippina herself. Roman sources describe an almost absurd sequence of attempts on her life, including most famously a self-sinking boat, engineered to collapse and drown her at sea, which she survived by swimming to shore. Nero eventually gave up on subtlety and simply sent soldiers to kill her directly. One account claims that when the assassin raised his sword, Agrippina told him to strike her in the stomach first, the womb that had carried the son who was now having her killed. Nero ruled for another decade after that, but his reign is remembered as increasingly erratic, and he ended it by taking his own life as Roman armies turned against him. The woman who'd committed murder to put him on the throne, and the son who'd committed murder to get her off it, were both gone within 14 years of each other, and neither death did much to secure what either of them had actually wanted. Peter the Great ran into this same problem from the other side, not as the one being plotted against, but as the one who had to decide what to do about the plot. His son and heir, Alexei, disagreed with almost everything his father believed in. The push to modernize Russia along Western lines, the constant wars, the brand new capital city being built up out of a swamp. Where Peter wanted a modern, outward-looking Russia, Alexei wanted things to go back to the old ways, and he had plenty of traditionalist supporters who agreed with him. Eventually, Alexei did something no loyal heir is supposed to do. He fled the country completely, running to the Habsburgs for protection, essentially defecting from his own father's empire. Peter lured him back home with promises of forgiveness, then immediately put him on trial for treason. Alexei was tortured until he gave a confession that implicated several people, including his own mother, and he was sentenced to death. He never actually made it to his execution. He died in prison just a few days after the sentence was handed down, under circumstances that were unclear even at the time. Officially, it was the after effects of the torture, but rumours of something more direct never really went away. There's a strange loop here. A son who betrayed his father's entire vision simply by wanting no part of it, and a father who responded by treating his own child exactly like any other threat to his rule. Peter had reshaped an entire country through sheer force of will. He couldn't reshape his own son into someone who actually wanted the throne he was about to inherit. And when he couldn't, he chose the empire over his own child. 5 rulers, 5 centuries, 5 completely different methods. A slit throat hidden under bandages for 3,000 years. A father staring out at his dead wife's tomb from inside a prison cell. A son strangled in his own father's tent because of a stepmother's whispers. A mother asking to be stabbed in the womb that bore the son who ordered her death. A father who let his own son be tortured to death rather than risk letting him take the throne. But underneath all of it sits the same brutal math. When a throne only has room for one person, and the people standing closest to it share your blood, that closeness stops being safety. It becomes the opposite, which might explain something that seems a little strange on the surface. Why so many of history's best defended rulers, men and women who'd survived wars, invasions, and assassination attempts, ended up keeping the people who loved them least right next to the throne, while pushing the people who might have actually loved them as far from any claim to it as possible. Ramses III's cracked, mummified throat is still on display in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, if you ever want to see it for yourself. And Shah Jahan's balcony is still there in Agra Fort too. You can stand in the exact same spot he stood, and look out at the exact same view he was forced to look at for 8 years until he died.